Hello everyone, welcome back in my channel. So today I am going to explain the rest of another parts of classical conditioning which is given by the Pavlov. So in previous class we have disclosed the concept of classical conditioning, know about the Pavlov, and also know about the stimulus response, as well as we know the experiment or examination of Pavlov. So now today I am going to explain the concept of classical conditioning. So let's start. The experiment of Pavlov is basic depends on four components. So those are unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. So those components will be disclosed separately. So at first we know the number one, unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned stimulus is a condition that naturally and automatically triggers a response, and as well as number two, unconditioned response is the unlearned response that occurs naturally in the response to the unconditioned stimulus. Now we know about the number three components of classical conditioning. So number three component of classical conditioning is a previously natural stimulus that, when provides within the unconditioned stimulus, triggers as a conditioned response. So we know about the conditioned stimulus, conditioned response, and conditioned stimulus. Now we know about the conditioned response. So conditioned response is learned response to the response. To learned response to the response is previous natural stimulus. So this is the four components of Pavlov classical conditioning. So now we know the principles of classical conditioning. So there are some principles of classical conditioning. Number one, acquisition. Number two, extinction. Number three, spontaneous recovery. Number four, stimulus generation. And number five, discrimination. So those components we know broadly. So at first we know the first principles of classical conditioning. So first principles of classical conditioning is acquisition. Acquisition means learning to give a known response to a new stimulus in the natural stimulus. So acquisition means learning to give a known response, which is always a known response to a new stimulus to the natural stimulus. So number two is extinction, is diminishing response that occurs when the CS no longer singles on the impending US. So there is the number two principles of classical conditioning. Now we know about the spontaneous recovery. So spontaneous recovery that after the extinctions and the without training, the previous CS suddenly elicit and the CR gain temporarily. Next principle is generalizations. The generalizations means the tendency to the response to stimulus stimulus. The generalization principles is the tendency to response to the stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus. When the generalization conduct number next is generalization. So generalizations means the tendency to response to stimulus, and this stimulus is stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus. So this stimulus is similar to the conditioned stimulus. Next, the last principles of the classical conditioning is discrimination. So discrimination is the learned ability to distinguishes between on the conditioned stimulus and after the irrelevant stimulus. So the learned ability of distinguishes between the conditioned stimulus and the other irrelevant condition. So those are the principles of classical conditioning. Now we are going to explain the another part of classical conditioning. So we know about the educational implication of classical conditioning. So the implications are: number one, use in the language or learning in the associating words with picture. So number one is use in language learning by the associating words and words with pictures. So number two is develop favorable attitudes towards learning, teachers, subject and schools. So next is developing good habits in children like cleanliness, like punctuality, etc. And lastly, we know the educational implication of classical conditioning is breaking the bad habits and elimination. So those are the educational implications which given by Pavlov. So in these sessions we have learned about the principles and educational implication and components of classical conditioning. So today I totally complete the Pavlov classical conditioning theory, and next day I will explain the another topic. So take care, bye.